many accounts, switcher locomotives on the Boston and Maine were the unsung workhorses of the fleet. They provided an extremely valuable and important task for the Boston and Maine Railroad, as they did for most railroads, and were well suited to extremely important everyday roles. Switcher locomotives were commonly used in, well, switch yards, to break down freight trains, put freight trains together, distribute freight cars to different parts of the yard, and also, occasionally, to spot freight cars at local industries in urban areas. On the Boston and Maine, switcher locomotives often found a role in passenger terminals as well, breaking down passenger trains, building passenger trains up, spotting milk cars and head-end cars, and that sort of thing in terminal locations. Due to the Boston and Maine's many lightweight rural branch lines, it was not uncommon at all to see switcher locomotives in freight service on freight lines, often pulling local freights quite some distance. Noteworthy locations with which switcher locomotives were used included East Manchester on the Portsmouth branch, and the Franklin Falls branch in central New Hampshire, which had a number of lightweight trestles which couldn't support the weight of larger locomotives. In extremely rare circumstances, switcher locomotives were used to haul passenger trains. One such example, which is commonly cited, is the shuttle train, which operated between Lowell and the Billerica Shops complex and carried Boston and Maine employees to and from work at the shops. The Boston and Maine rostered quite a number of switcher locomotives in different classes throughout its lengthy history, but they can be broken down into three main wheel arrangements. The smallest of which were the 040s. These small locomotives were very adept at navigating tight curves and serving industries in locations like Manchester, New Hampshire and Lowell, Massachusetts, which had vast mill complexes with tight curves and close sidings. Quite a number of the 040s were actually inherited from earlier railroads that the Boston and Maine had either purchased or leased, and therefore they fell under the Boston and Maine umbrella. The 040s on the Boston and Maine were assigned the F class, and they were used in the later part of the 1800s up until the time just after World War I. Although most of the 040s were sold or scrapped by 1918, the Boston and Maine bought one second-hand 040 in 1926, and another actually lasted until 1940. The very last 040 switcher to survive on the Boston and Maine was number 65, which had been built as Concord and Montreal Railroad number 72 in Manchester, New Hampshire in December of 1891. This impressive locomotive, for its size anyway, had 16 by 22 cylinders and was given the designation F6. Although the locomotive was highlighted by various railroad preservation groups as worthy of saving, and the Boston and Maine actually took some stock in that process as well, the locomotive was unfortunately scrapped in May of 1940, having long been replaced by more able 060 and 080 machines. In addition to the 040s, the Boston and Maine rostered a larger number of 060 switchers, and again, many of these were inherited from other railroads like the Fitchburg Railroad, the Connecticut River Railroad, the Concord and Montreal, and on and on. These were a motley mix of locomotives with different sizes and shapes. The earlier locomotives were given classes G, G2, G3, G4A and G4B, G5, G6, and G7. Most Boston and Maine steam enthusiasts tend to be interested in the post-World War I era, which makes things a little simpler because during that time the locomotive fleet on the Boston and Maine was a little less confusing and a little bit more standardized. Because of that, most of the attention in terms of switchers, at least for the 060s, gets directed to the G10 and G11 class 060 switchers. The G10 class specifically was extremely numerous and was built between 1903 and 1910 by Manchester Locomotive Works. These were all built with 19 by 24 cylinders. Some of the G10s were equipped with snow melters, and they had a partially wrapped pipe coming from the steam dome across the top of the boiler and down in front of the cylinders, an interesting application on B&M switchers. The G10 switchers on the Boston and Maine came as built with wooden cabs, single air pumps, and oil headlights. The cabs were later swapped out for steel ones, and the headlights replaced with electric versions. The air pumps were later switched to twin air pumps. The very last G10 class switcher in existence on the Boston and Maine, number 720, was finally scrapped in May of 1949. A number of the aging G10 class switchers were sold to other ownership by the Boston and Maine Railroad. These included the Montpelier and Wells River Railroad, the Troy Furnace Company, the St. Johnsbury and Lamoille County Railroad, an H.E. Fletcher Company granite quarry in Westford, Massachusetts. Less numerous than the G10 switchers, but more modern, the G11 switchers were built by Manchester Locomotive Works in 1911 and 1913. A subclass, the G11Bs, were built by Brooks in 1916. The G11s had 19 by 26 cylinders, and the G11Bs came with 20 by 26 cylinders. The G11s were built with slope-back tenders, whereas the G11Bs were built with box tenders. The G11As changed slightly over their careers, having oil headlights when built, flared stacks, and single-phase air pumps. These would all be replaced before their careers were ended on the Boston and Maine. The G11Bs were actually very little changed over their history. Two of the G11 class switches were surprisingly equipped with center-mounted headlights instead of high-mounted headlights. These two were 446 and 448. Finally, the very last class of 060 switchers on the Boston and Maine were actually not built for the Boston and Maine, but survived on the Boston and Maine quite late. These four locomotives were built for the Portland Terminal Railroad, which was a joint switching operation between the Boston and Maine and the Maine Central Railroad in the greater Portland, Maine area. These four locomotives were numbered 830, 831, 832, and 834. All four machines had 21 by 28 cylinders and were built by the Alco Locomotive Works in Schenectady, New York. These four units were given the designation G11C on the Boston and Maine. 834 was sold to the Eastern Gas and Fuel Company in August of 1951. 831 and 832 were both scrapped in 1952, and 830 was finally scrapped in 1953. Surprisingly enough, these four locomotives were actually bought by the Boston and Maine in June of 1951 from the Portland Terminal, giving them extremely short service lives on the Boston and Maine. The very last series of steam switchers that the Boston and Maine purchased and utilized during their steam period were the H-Class 080 USRA-designed steam locomotives. These came under three different class distinctions. The H1As, 600 and 601, which were built in 1916 by Alco Schenectady, had 25 by 30 cylinders. The H2A class were built by Schenectady in 1922, and they came with 25 by 28 cylinders. Finally, the H3A class locomotives were built by Baldwin in 1927 and 1929, and they came with 23 by 28 cylinders. The 080s served in steam switching service on the Boston and Maine Railroad into the 1950s, although a few of them were sold. Number 600 and 601 were sold to the Portland Terminal in 1935. Four units, number 611, number 614, number 623, and number 629, were all sold to the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad in 1946. Finally, number 617 was sold to the Maine Central Railroad in 1946. The very last 080 switcher, number 622, was scrapped in 1957 by the Boston and Maine Railroad, specifically on July 1st. The strangest and most unlikely of switchers on the Boston and Maine was Class M. These enigmatic locomotives were only two in number, 800 and 801, built in 1922. These were massive machines, 0880 type articulated locomotives, and they had been built by Alco Schenectady and given the class designation M2A on the Boston and Maine. These locomotives had been purchased by the Boston and Maine for hump yard switching and helper service out of Mechanicville, New York. They only spent 7 years on the Boston and Maine before they were disposed of, and they were both sold to the Bingham and Garfield, Utah copper operation in September of 1929. As the diesel locomotive began to appear on the scene in the years before World War II, diesel switchers became increasingly common on American railroads, and also on the Boston and Maine. Various diesel switchers were utilized by the Boston and Maine just prior to World War II, made by a few different manufacturers, including Ingersoll Rand. But by and large, the most numerous diesel switchers to appear before the war started were built by EMD, the SW series, and by General Electric, their 44-tonners. By the time World War II was over, the diesel locomotive had arrived in force, and by the early 1950s, additional EMD SW units, SW1, SW8, and SW9 had begun to supplement the diesel locomotive fleet for the Boston and Maine. Because of this, the aging steam switchers were seen as unnecessary, and definitely not the way of the future. Surprisingly enough, 2 of the surviving 5 Boston and Maine steam locomotives are switcher locomotives, but they weren't saved by a preservation movement, at least at that point in time. The H.E. Fletcher Company of Westford, Massachusetts, was a well-known granite quarry, and for a long time had a railroad operating as part of its regular operations. They utilized switcher locomotives to pull granite in and out of the pit and into the finishing sheds, as well as interchanging with the Boston and Maine Railroad's Stony Brook branch. On June 29, 1950, the Boston and Maine sold one of their G11 class switchers, number 410, to the H.E. Fletcher Company. Then, in April 1952, the Boston and Maine sold one of its G11B switchers, number 444, to H.E. Fletcher as well. The 2 switcher locomotives operated at the Fletcher Pit and plant in the 1950s before being sidelined in favor of new center cab diesel switchers. After being taken out of service, the 2 locomotives languished on the Fletcher property for decades afterwards, being buried by trees and foliage, and occasionally visited by curious rail fans who snapped pictures of the rusting locomotives hidden away not far from the heart of the Boston and Maine Railroad in northern Massachusetts. It wasn't for about 20 years later that the preservation story involving these 2 locomotives would really begin. Number 410 was acquired by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in the 1970s for preservation at the Museum of Transportation in Boston, and was moved in the late 1970s to the Boston and Maine shops at North Billerica, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, that plan was not realized, however. But through the efforts of national, state, and local agencies, number 410 was slowly cosmetically restored at Billerica, and later moved to Lowell, Massachusetts on July 17, 1993. At that point in time, the Boston and Maine, then run by Guilford Transportation Industries, was still serving customers on the city trackage in Lowell, which wound its way through the mill complexes in downtown Lowell, Massachusetts. Because of the direct rail connection, number 410 was directly brought in and moved to the spot where it sits today, before being craned onto a display track. The Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society has been involved with the restoration of the 410 since 1992, when a group of our members, led by Jim Nigsis, began working on the engine's cosmetic appearance at North Billerica. By the time the locomotive arrived at Lowell and was craned over to the spot where she today sits, 410 had been scraped, painted, and lettered by National Park Service and Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society volunteers. Today, number 410, along with wooden combine coach number 1244, form the centerpiece of the transportation portion of the National Park site in Lowell, Massachusetts. The other 060 switcher, G11B number 444, also found its way into preservation, making its way to the State Fairgrounds in Dunkirk, New York, where it sits today, cosmetically restored and on display. Though they may have been small in stature, their role on the Boston and Maine was anything but. The switchers provided an invaluable service to the Boston and Maine Railroad day in and day out, and could be counted on by the railroad for a multitude of important tasks. They could be counted on by enthusiasts as well, who could see them in just about any yard that the Boston and Maine operated, and photographs and film abound of these units during the steam era on the Boston and Maine Railroad. Perhaps then it's extremely fitting that if you want to witness a Boston and Maine steam locomotive with your own eyes in the modern world, not one, but two switcher locomotives have been preserved, so you can do just that. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss a new video. And head on over to our website, www.B&MRRHS.org, where you can learn how to support our nonprofit organization, sign up to become a member, browse an extensive online archive of B&M materials, watch more programs, listen to our podcast, or browse our online store.